On September 6th, the Guards Armoured Division, leading 30 Corps, were ordered to capture 2 bridges over the Albert Canal.
This was a preliminary to Operation Comet,
which in turn became Operation Market Garden. One bridge had been destroyed, but the other at Beringen was still usable by infantry, and a small bridgehead was established on September 7th. Gradually the bridgehead was enlarged, and the Royal Engineers built a Bailey Bridge to take tanks. German resistance in the area had been stiff. A miscellaneous collection of retreating troops had been formed into a battle group with the precise intention of defending the line of the Albert Canal, and the Germans began to appreciate the importance of the line. So they brought down reinforcements from the north to strengthen their defences still further. It was imperative that this line be destroyed because of the imminence of Market Garden. In addition, 11th Armoured Division had been having great difficulty breaking out of the Antwerp area, just to the west. So the commander of 30 Corps, General Horrocks, ordered 50th Northumbrian Division to capture another bridgehead over the Albert Canal at Geel. Early on September 8th, the 69th Brigade of this division attacked across the canal and began the building of a bridge. On the next day, 151 Brigade passed through and captured the village of Oostum on the way to Geel, but they found themselves under heavy German counterattack from tanks and infantry. Thus it was that early in the morning of September 10th, Stanley Christoffer received orders to take the Sherwood Rangers into the bridgehead to support 151 Brigade and drive through to capture Geel, a largish town a few miles beyond the Albert Canal. It was mid-morning on September 10th when we first set off from our position south of the Albert Canal. Visibility was good, but the weather was sultry, with the threat of thunder. Lack of information about the enemy made our crossing seem uneventful and tolerably pleasant, but then ignorance is bliss. C Squadron was to support the 6th Battalion DLI. We linked up with them to the southwest of Geel, and then at 2 in the afternoon, after an artillery barrage, we started off towards the town, the infantry just ahead of our tanks. The approach across was flat pasteurised, devoid of the sort of dangers we had faced in Normandy, but we were aware that carefree swanning through the countryside was at an end, and we remained watchful. The atmosphere was tense. The company I was supporting seemed abnormally small, since I never saw more than about 30 men, and after we had gone through about 100 yards, the inevitable Spandaus opened up. The infantry had a rotten time, and I could see them falling to the left and right of me. One of their officers was virtually cut in half, as he received a belt of bullets all to himself. They then all went to ground, and in whatever cover they could find, and frantically waved at us to take the lead. It was one of those days when I thanked my lucky stars that I had not volunteered to join the infantry. My own troop that day consisted of myself, Sergeant Nesling, and Corporal Burnett. Both of their tanks were Fireflies and fitted with a 17-pounder gun, which was much more suited to tank killing role, while my own tank, 75mm, was an ideal weapon for infantry support because of its high rate of fire. But the Fireflies lacked a second machine gun, and, as I did not have a co-driver/lap gunner, my own tank was also effectively operating with just one machine gun. So the firepower of my troop was more limited than would have seemed wise in the circumstances. Nonetheless, we advanced beyond the infantry, carrying whatever holes they could scrape out of the ground, and we put down the heaviest fire we could with our machine guns and main guns. The Germans remained in their slit trenches, firing back, but lacked the capacity to do us much harm. At one stage I moved so close to their trenches, I had to reverse my tank in order to depress the gun sufficiently to fire high explosive point blank. All this had the desired effect. The enemy simply could not cope with the weight of fire we put down, and we just ran the trenches over so that the infantry following up behind us could poke the Germans out at point of bayonet. From time to time a white flag would appear in some positions, but we could not get out to take the surrender, for fear of being sniped from elsewhere, so we just passed these groups by and left them to the infantry. B Squadron following closely behind us, and then fanning out to the southwest corner of the bridgehead in support of the 9th DLI, also experienced some intense fighting. That afternoon they were violently counterattacked, and although they withstood it, Michael Gold was wounded in the head, subsequently losing an eye. Meanwhile my troop joined the road that ran into Geel from the west. I told the nearest platoon commander, the only other officer I could see, that if he followed closely behind me, I would put a shell into every house on either side of the street. This would reduce the danger of Spandau fire that was always such a nightmare for the infantry. As we moved into the town outskirts, we knocked out an 88mm, sighted near a farmhouse, and then steadily made our way towards the centre. Our progress was accompanied by the almost consistent pinging of Spandau bullets on the armour of the tank. I directed our fire onto every house we passed, and then we approached a T-junction where another 88mm and an ammunition lorry were burning. Germans were now surrendering in ever-increasing numbers. Civilians also began to come out of their houses and wave Belgian flags at us, so I really had the feeling that another town had been successfully liberated. I calculated that in our passage through the town, we had fired about 60 shells. We were beginning to run short of ammunition, and so I left the infantry to look after the prisoners and headed straight into the main square of Geel. Corporal Burnett, just behind me, brewed up a German staff car, and 3 officers who had been in it ran for their lives. We also destroyed 4 light anti-aircraft guns. We had encountered only moderate resistance, and had not yet seen any German tanks or serviceable anti-tank weapons, apart from the 188mm we had shot up. At the centre of Geel, where I had now firmly planted my troop, all seemed quite quiet, so much that I called up Jack Holman on the radio to tell him the way was clear. He roared up about 10 minutes later in his scout car, by which time I had positioned my troop of tanks and the infantry to cover the main approaches from the north and east. The rest of C Squadron had reached Geel and were either somewhere in town or on the outskirts. Jack made himself his HQ with us in the main square, and we assumed that position would soon be consolidated by the arrival of further support. As the day wore on, however, it became clear that all was not well. There appeared to be fierce fighting going on in other parts of the bridgehead, this side of the Albert Canal, and when I switched over the radio frequencies to the other squadrons, the presence of German tanks was mentioned several times. Just before dark, disturbing reports came through that a strong German counterattack had been mounted on the bridgehead, and soon after news that the road back to the canal had been cut. We were effectively surrounded in Geel. Even more ominously, the civilians began to take down the flags and bunting with which they had greeted us, no doubt anticipating that we might not be around for much longer. It was a rather eerie feeling to realise that they knew something we did not. I let Sergeant Nesling go further up the road to the north, off the square towards the railway. Then I made a recce on foot myself. On the level crossing stood a self-propelled gun, and there were clear signs that other Germans were in the vicinity. We retreated back to our previous positions in the square to await events. Soon around dusk, the sound of firing erupted not very far away. I later learned that the whole of Ted Cook's troop had been knocked out, and Ted himself killed. I had become quite friendly with him since he had joined us after Belgian, and we had spent a good day together in Brussels. He came from Gloucestershire and looked like Gary Cooper, had recently been married and was just 21 years old. The enemy were now very close to us in the square. Suddenly a German self-propelled gun appeared down the road I was watching, but I saw him before he saw us and shot him up. The problem was that it was impossible to watch all the approaches satisfactorily, with just 3 tanks and half a company of infantry. Jack called up the colonel to ask for more tank support, but was told that this was impossible before morning. We were now very short of ammunition, but Sergeant Stanton made a bold dash with ammunition through the German cordon to reach us, an act of considerable heroism. As darkness fell, we became increasingly nervous. The Germans opposing us were very determined. Their infantry kept penetrating within our lines, and then used flares to illuminate our tanks, making them an easy target for their own tanks as they crept up. Our own infantry was so thin on the ground that it was virtually impossible to stop this infiltration. Between Geel and the canal were a lot of sunken lanes and orchards, which gave plenty of cover to the attackers. Johnny Mann was hit in the head by a sniper as he stood in his turret, and then his tank was set on fire, engulfing the whole crew. Johnny was one of the most experienced officers left in the regiment, having been with it since North Africa. We remained on the alert throughout the night, which was the worst I've ever spent anywhere. The infantry kept sending us deeply pessimistic reports, then asking us to go out to perform some impossible task, such as dealing with an enemy patrol that they had supposedly seen to their front. Just before midnight, we heard what sounded like a Jagdpanther, but for a long time we could not see where it was. Then Corporal Burnett spotted it creeping down a side street, waited for it around a corner, and then sent an armour-piercing shot from his 17-pounder into its fighting compartment at just 10 yards range. I felt the blast a good 100 yards away, and of course waited in greater trepidation for the next infiltration by the enemy. Tank battles at such short range were not likely to lead to a very long life, I thought to myself, and I'm sure everyone else there was thinking exactly the same. Sadly, Corporal Burnett was killed by a sniper the next day, and my troop lost a very skilled and brave tank commander. At dawn we heard still more German tanks milling about as they began to shell us in earnest. My own tank was covered in bricks, plaster and glass. There was dust everywhere, even inside the tank. All my crew were tired and apprehensive, as I was too, but I thanked my lucky stars that I had men as steadfast as Bob Ingle, Jim Darrington and Bill Cousins with me. The infantry with us from the DLI were nothing like so steadfast. They were clearly demoralised and battle-weary, having been in the van of the advance since D-Day. They abandoned some of their positions, and even some of the anti-tank guns, which they had brought into Geel, so I had to go and remove the firing pins, to prevent the guns being of any use to the enemy. When morning came, we realised that we had no infantry left in front of us to protect us from Panzerfaust. The Germans must have felt confident that we were finished, because at about midday, when things seemed quieter, the infantry started marching up the road towards us in a line. This was a golden opportunity, and we made the most of it, firing our machine guns at close range into their formation. Then, a little later, I had a message from Jack to join him in the square on foot. He had decided to withdraw to prepared positions in the south, and he wanted to inform Jimmy McWilliam and me how he proposed to effect this really rather difficult and dangerous manoeuvre. Jack was aware that our position in the centre of Geel was precarious to say the least. Only 6 tanks of the squadron were still intact, and it could only be a matter of time before we were overrun. Furthermore, B Squadron, in trying to reinforce us, had lost 7 tanks themselves. Michael Gold and Colin Thompson had been wounded, and Dick Holman in A Squadron had been very lucky to escape almost unscathed when his tank was hit and one of his crew killed. In the event, he had to retire from action for a while, with burst eardrums. Jimmy and I made our way back to our tanks, which had been standing virtually back to back, while he watched one road and I the other. Suddenly there was an almighty crash, and Jimmy's tank burst into flames. He and all his crew tumbled out except for his driver, Corporal Higgins, whom we presumed and hoped had been killed outright. It was a wicked moment. I had no idea from where the shot had come, or what kind of weapon had been used, and it was clear that Jimmy's crew were no wiser than us. I moved slightly forward, presuming Jimmy must have been hit by something coming down the street he had been watching, but in truth the shot could come from either direction, or from one of any number of houses overlooking us. But either way, I sent a message over the air that we were now another tank short. My mind was full of horrors. I'd seen at the closest possible range what happened to Jimmy, and now it was very likely that the same was going to happen to me. Here I was sitting in my Sherman with all its firepower, but I could not identify any target, or even guess in which direction I should be looking. Sure enough, about 2 minutes later there was a terrific sheet of flame, and a shower of sparks as we were hit. We fired the Browning machine gun in what we thought was the direction of the shot, and backed furiously, if rather clumsily, into the main square, thankful to be able to move at all. A piece of shrapnel grazed my forehead and taken my beret with it, but that was the extent of the damage to any of us. My driver, Bob Ingle, said he had seen a German infantryman a second before he fired his Panzerfaust at us, and had felt the blast on his legs. I did not have the chance right then to look at the damage, but I later found that half a track plate had been shot away on our starboard side, and that a hole had been punched right through the entire sprocket assembly, into the differential. If we had had a co-driver that day, he would almost certainly have been killed, or at least lost his legs. I could only thank God that the German did not fire directly at the turret, because the range could not have been more than 10 yards. We were very fortunate still to be alive, let alone able to move. The biggest fear of any tank crew was a direct hit. Most of us experienced one at some time or another, and it was largely a matter of luck whether you emerged alive. I jumped out of my tank in the main square and ran across to talk to Jack. Meanwhile, Sergeant Nesling, who was commanding the remaining tank in my troop, still had to come back from his rather exposed forward position. He managed this at top speed with his Browning blazing away in the area of which he believed the Panzerfaust shot had come. Jack and I were now the only 2 officers left from the squadron. Jimmy McWilliam was sitting in a doorway. He appeared quite cheerful, but had been badly burned. One of his hands and a leg looked messy. It was the 3rd time that he had been wounded, and this particular occasion had tested his considerable sense of humour to the limit. But he was still able to joke and tell me what he intended to do when he got back to Glasgow, so I had a feeling that he would be alright. We now had permission to withdraw, and we completed this safely while there was still daylight. The order was predetermined, with tanks going first and last, and protecting the infantry, the fitters and the wounded in the middle. I cannot recall that we suffered any casualties in this manoeuvre, but I am certain that we would have been wiped out if we had stayed in Geel any longer. We spent a day regrouping, and then came up into the town again, this time accompanied by elements of the 15th Scottish Division. We were shelled in our approach, but otherwise the town was much quieter. The Germans had forcibly removed all Belgian males between the ages of 16 and 60 when they retreated, and the women of the town were crying uncontrollably. Geel was itself a shambles, with hundreds of our own and German dead still lying around. Padre Leslie Skinner recorded in his diary what he saw and did on September 12th. After half an hour, shelling died down, and I managed to take the truck forward to Geel, took up bodies I buried hurriedly last night, then cleared what was left of Johnny Mann's tank. Fearful job searching ash. Went on to clear 2 other tanks knocked out yesterday. Ghastly. 2 orderlies helping me had to give up. Buried 10 across Canal, an extension of Stellham Parish Church grounds, where infantry had already begun burials. In view of time factor and crossing and recrossing Canal, decided to bury remaining casualties in Geel. Collected several more and left them stitched in blankets, etc., behind churchyard wall, while I went for others. When I returned, found Belgian civilians had prepared a space for a mass grave for several civilian dead, and had gathered up the Sherwood Rangers, previously prepared for burial by me. Quite an argument ensued. At last agreed to have 2 services. I would bury my dead at one end, and then leave them to do the same with their own. As I read the service, shells flew over very close. When one actually hit the church, the Belgians fled, leaving me and my driver to finish the service. When the next shell hit the church wall, above our heads, we both instinctively dived for cover, only time in my life I've actually been in a grave during a service. At the time did not seem at all odd, merely sensible. A few moments later, service resumed and finished. In total, the Sherwood Rangers lost 11 tanks and had 2 damaged. They suffered 46 casualties around Geel, 24 of whom were killed. Corporal Higgins was Jimmy McWilliams' driver, who was instantly killed when the Panzerfaust hit the tank. The Fallschirmjäger soldier firing it was Heinz Kohn, who was positioned in the cafe between Hills and McWilliams. His actions were later used in German propaganda. Trooper Gerald Story, Hill's old driver, who had taken command of his own Sherman, was also killed, along with his whole crew. Captain John Mann was killed, as previously mentioned, along with his crew. There was Corporal Burnett, who was killed by a sniper bullet while in the turret of his Sherman. Also as mentioned, Lieutenant Alfred Cook, who was killed along with all the crews of his whole troop of 3 Shermans, who were ambushed by a concealed Jagdpanther, who let them pass before knocking them out from the rear, as they tried to relieve Hills and the other members of C Squadron trapped in the centre of Geel. Also lost was Trooper Bridge, Trooper Fothergill, Corporal Hannam, Trooper Reed, Trooper Saunders, Trooper Sims, Sergeant Wilson, Trooper Winchester, Trooper Blaxall, Corporal Carter, Trooper Francis, Trooper Geenan, Trooper Higgs, Trooper Randall, Trooper Reddington, Trooper Tarry, Trooper Thomas, Trooper Lake, and finally Corporal Harris, who was wounded at Geel, but died of his wounds 5 days later. The fighting at Geel was followed by a few days' rest at Leopoldsburg, about 30 miles or so east and close to Beringen. It was an attractive wooded countryside, and we camped in some heather among the trees. The rest of 8th Armour Brigade was there too, celebrating the first official stand-down that could be remembered since D-Day. And we also heard that at long last some decorations had come through for the regiment. John Semken, A Squadron Commander, had won the MC, along with Ian Greenway, who had lost his leg in Normandy, and Johnny Mann, so recently killed at Geel. There were also MMs for Sergeant Saunders, Nelson, and Burge, while Sergeant Dring had won a bar to his MM. All of these were thoroughly deserved, and gave a lift to the whole regiment. Our deeds had been both recorded and appreciated. Our rest at Leopoldsburg was gradually overtaken by preparations for the next big push, and it was clear that it was something out of the ordinary.